the information on Patti. Okay. Have you ever wondered what the women were doing when the men were off to war?
Yes.
It's probably unkind of me to mention that if you read the journals of the British officers stationed in Charleston, many of those fine ladies were wining and dining the British officers. That was not true in the backcountry. And we are made of sterner stuff. And we are pleased this morning to have Patti here to tell us about it. So welcome, please, Patti Proctor.
Good morning, everyone. How are we doing this morning? Excellent. I understand that some of you were up early to make a donut run. I can guarantee you I was the only one up about 4:30 using my frying pan to iron my outfit. That I can pretty much tell you. No one else was up earlier offering to come help me iron. I could have used a few volunteers who have no idea how long it takes to iron one of these skirts. That's why we use our frying pan. You cover a lot more space with a bigger item than a little hand iron. Now, I must inquire, has anyone ever been up to the Waxhaws? Oh, excellent! You're familiar with that wonderful Garden of Eden. Yes. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some ladies who live there and in the Charlotte area, and then I'm going to kind of branch out. I am a backcountry woman. My family settled in the Waxhaws in 1752 along 12 Mile Creek. Everything was fairly good until around 1780 when the British came calling. Life changes rather dramatically then for these ladies. One particular lady that I stopped on my way down here to visit was a lady by the name of Susanna Barnett. And when I got to her house on my way down here, she informed me I had just missed Mrs. Sumter, the general's wife. Why, you know, they took her on horseback all the way to Waxhaw to avoid the British. And the woman was an invalid. She was paralyzed. They actually put the mattress on the horse, set her atop the mattress, and had someone ride behind her. Not an easy task at all. And by the time she reached poor Mrs. Barnett's house, she was black and blue. She had fallen off that horse so many times. Not an easy trip for a woman. And by the way, she was 8 years older than her husband. Now, Mrs. Barnett is a very wonderful lady. I learned about her from an 1864 Godey's magazine. It had a chapter in it entitled A Carolina Woman in the Revolution. She lived somewhere along 521. If anyone's been to Waxhaw, you know the Waxhaws run from pretty much Waxhaw Community, which is about 30 miles south of Charlotte, down to Lancaster, over to the Catawba River, and over to Monroe. It was named for the Waxhaw Indians. And it was an early settlement in the area. Mrs. Barnett's house was over toward 521, probably toward Pineville, back toward Indian Land. After the Battle of Buford's Massacre, you are familiar with that, I'm sure. Yes. She took in several Patriot soldiers who had been injured. There were 6 of these gentlemen. Among them, they had 2 good arms and 2 good legs. Such was the devastation at that battle. She nursed these gentlemen back to health, and they went back to their militia unit. But as I said, the British come calling, and lo and behold, Tarleton stops at her home. They were foraging for food. They go out, and they search her barn, and they come across Mrs. Barnett's horse. Now, I gotta tell you, we women in the backcountry are partial to our horses, to say the very least. Well, the British soldier leads the horse out. Susanna Barnett comes flying off her porch, goes out there and takes the other side of that bridle. Things are not looking good at this point. She and the officer have a little debate about who gets to keep the horse. In the end, Susanna gets to keep the horse, with his warning words to the British. If you take my horse, you will be shot at from every tree in the county. Yep, the horse stayed. Now, there's another incident when the British come calling on Susanna Barnett. Poor woman has children, quite a few of them, and she had just milked her only cow. She had the cream sitting up on the porch in the crock, and the British come back looking for food. They weren't so successful the first time, but I guess maybe they thought she had a change of heart. Before they ever dismount, she tips over the cream. Even her children don't get any. Much better to go hungry than to give it to the British. Interesting lady, to say the very least. Now, we also know in the Waxhaws you have another interesting lady, and I'm sure you're familiar with her. Her name is Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson. Her son is Andrew Jackson. Elizabeth Jackson comes to the Waxhaws in 1765. Now, I have to wonder what she told her husband, Andrew Jr., when they left to sail across. She had a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old. They were coming to a new world with no home and nothing there but family members. I'm sure that was a trip that lady had to think long and hard about taking. The family survives. They come in through Charleston and make it up to the Waxhaws along 12 Mile Creek. Andrew buys perhaps 200 acres of bottomland. Sadly to say, in 1767, he is injured and dies. A few weeks later, Andrew, his youngest son, is born. By 1780, Andrew is 13 years old. He has 2 older brothers, Robert and Hugh, and the family is living in the home of the Crawfords, her sister, who is an invalid. And what's a good patriot mother to do? Because you know this nice Scotch-Irish lady is probably not going to take up the loyalist cause. There's no love lost between the Scotch-Irish and the British soldiers in the Waxhaws. So, her first son enlists, fights in the Battle of Eutaw Springs, is stricken and died with heat in the fatigues of battle. The second son, Hugh, and Andrew are actually captured shortly after the Battle of Hanging Rock. They are actually imprisoned in Camden in the British prison there. Now, as every good mother would do, Elizabeth Jackson sets out from Waxhaw and her home and walks to Camden. She persuades the British in charge there to release her sons, and they do. Hugh is so sick, he dies within 2 days of getting to Waxhaw. Andrew is so sick, it takes him about 6 months to recover. Once he is well enough for her to leave, she understands that her 2 nephews, the Crawford boys, are on the British prison ships in Charleston Harbor. She's already walked to Camden. Might as well set off for Charleston. She does. She nurses the American prisoners on the British prison ships, and in about 2 to 3 weeks, she is taken with a fever. Some people believe it to be cholera. It's referred to as ship's fever. She is taken to a friend's home, and Agnes Barton, who grew up in Waxhaw and would have known Elizabeth Jackson. Agnes Barton dresses her in her best dress, and they bury her outside the walls of Charleston. To this day, her grave is unmarked. Andrew Jackson receives her belongings, and at 13 years old, he is an orphan. Elizabeth Jackson has a monument built to her at Old Waxhaw Presbyterian Church on Lansford Road off of Highway 521. Her husband and her 2 sons are also buried there, Robert and Hugh. Now, there's another lady I have to tell you about. Has anybody ever had the British come to their house? Now, ladies, I know you can see them coming. They raise a little dust, and the horses make a little bit of noise. That's what happened to Susan Jane McDowell. Now, she lived on the Still Creek community in Charlotte, and she's out there at her home one day, and lo and behold, here they come. They ransack her house right up until the moment the captain in charge, a Captain MacDowell of the British forces, asks her name. He orders an immediate stop, realizes they could be cousins. He wasn't sure, so he figured he didn't want to plunder her house too bad. She actually realized the British are retreating out of Charlotte and crossing back over the Catawba. She dresses in her husband's clothes, saddles her horse, and goes up to find her husband, who's with the militia up toward Concord and Salisbury, telling them of the British movements. Not a bad lady, to say the very least. These British officers are not finding these women in the Carolinas particularly welcoming to their efforts. Then, of course, we have Eleanor Wilson. One of her family members signed the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. Lord Cornwallis and Lord Tarleton actually come to her house and order her to cook dinner. She does. And they have a rather lively conversation about this. The two gentlemen trying to convince her that if her husband and sons will lay down their arms, he will give them land, money, a rank in the British Army. Eleanor ponders this a bit. I would ponder it too, because you really don't know if the British are going to win. And she informs these two gentlemen, well, I'd rather my sons be patriots than my husband, and if I must, I will take up my own rifle and die for my country. Pretty much after that, I doubt if there was much dinner conversation. I don't think they would have said a lot in reply. The British seem baffled by these women. They're home alone. They're protecting the men. They're fending for themselves. Life is not easy. And there's one particular lady by the name of Harriet Prudence Hall Patterson. She lived over in Rock Hill, and she decided they needed some medicines. Well, Harriet gets on her horse from Rock Hill, South Carolina, over toward Chester in York County, rides all the way to Charleston. She is caught one time and managed to convince them she's going to nurse her sons in Charleston. The British let her go. Little do they realize she's smuggling medicines back for the American forces. Yes. A rather resourceful lady, to say the very least. And then, over along the west side of the Catawba, in Fishing Creek. Anybody been to Fishing Creek? Excellent. You do know it's underwater. Yes, part of it where the houses were. Just wondered about that one. Now there's a lady there who's kind of a tragic woman in the war. Her brother-in-law is with the Patriot forces, coming on one side of her house. The British are coming up the other side of her house. Her name is Mrs. Stallions. We do not know her first name. Well, her house is right between them. And lo and behold, Mrs. Stallions is wearing her husband's hat. Well, she opens the door, shot dead through the head. Neither army claims that one or the other did it. She lost her life that day because the armies just chose her yard to fight in. Then, of course, you've got Margaret McCurdy and her daughter. Now, Margaret McCurdy's husband's with the militia, and the men have been in her house melting down pewter to make bullets. And the British come by. She's really not happy with them. They take her chickens. And while they're taking her chickens, she's a very resourceful woman. She knows the militia is close enough by to know what's going on. And she sends her young daughter, 7 or 8 years old, out to gather the cows. Before she goes out, she slips a note in the heel of her shoe, telling them where the British are and what they are doing. The young girl goes out looking for the cows. Her father finds her instead because he's been around the house watching the activities. He takes the note, and they head off the British and have a brief skirmish along the way across the Catawba. Ladies are very daring, to say the least. Mary Johnston lived also along the Catawba River, probably a little bit further below the Fishing Creek area, maybe a little bit closer to Granite Falls. Her husband and father are also with the militia. She's approximately 20 years old when they come calling. The British appear, they're still foraging in and out of the communities. The ladies really don't know who to trust. Mary Johnson is an expert markswoman. She's been taught to handle firearms since she was 10 years old. She is a dead shot. She organizes the ladies in her community to what today we would call a community watch. These ladies decide that if they hang out a particular quilt, the militiamen will know they can come home. The British are not in the area. If the British are in the area, they hang out a different quilt, and it's not safe for anyone to return. For her acts, she is also awarded her husband's pension and a separate pension from the militia because of her bravery. If we come on a little tiny bit further south, we're going to come into a lady by the name of Nancy Anderson Green. Nancy Anderson has not had a good life. Her husband fought the Indians. He was a trapper and dealt with the Cherokee and the Catawbas, right up until he was on a scouting party and they murdered him. Nancy's left at home with 3 children who have the smallpox. No food except the fish they can get. And a gentleman comes to town. His name is Robert Green. He's a rather ragged-looking gentleman, and everyone in the community is kind of afraid of him, not knowing what his business is. Maybe he's a spy. Well, he and Nancy take up a conversation. He really hates to take her horse, but he needs to go back and join the militia. The only way he can do that is if he has a horse that would be easier traveling. And she invites him in to eat. She fixes him a few meals for the week. He does a little work around her cabin floor. And then, at the end of the week, they decide to get married. 1 week. Decided to get married. She wasn't sure she was going to find another single man. Maybe he didn't know if he was going to find another widow woman. Well, they go over to the Justice of the Peace. They pay $1. All the money they have. And they're married. Now, I got to tell you, and regardless of any community, that is going to get everybody talking. You think so? Yeah, even today, that would get everybody talking. Yep. So, he goes back off and joins the militia. Nancy's got to fend for herself again until they returns. Nancy Anderson and Robert Green are married over 50 years. So there is some love and war. It worked out for them, to say the very least. Now, there's quite a bit of activity here in this area, I've noticed. And I'm sure I've given you some examples of the ladies in the Waxhaws. And remember, this is taking place in 1780. Cornwallis is actually in Charlotte for about 2 weeks. Well, I'm going to have to set up a hospital and a printing press. Well, I saw one of those broadsides he printed. And let me tell you what it said. The gist of it. I don't read too well. Well, it said that if they took my cows or my chickens or my horse, they were going to pay me. I haven't seen any money. And not only was he going to pay me, they referred to us as diluted citizens. I don't know what that word means, but I don't think it sounds good. To say the very least. And in order to encourage the men around the Charlottetown area, those fine young ladies signed a document. I don't see him here today. And evidently you ladies didn't sign the document because it stated right plainly they wouldn't go out on dates with any man that wasn't in the militia. I would ask about the gentlemen in the audience. Apparently they aren't in the militia because they're all sitting here today. Now, ladies, you might want to be careful with the company you're keeping. Something to consider, to say the very least. Now, Now, if we move on up a little bit toward Cabarrus County. Anybody ever been up toward Cabarrus County? Concord? Oh, yes. Along Rocky River. I told you a little bit earlier about Margaret McCurdy. Time to meet her sister-in-law, Mary McCurdy, who lived in the Concord area. Now, the interesting thing about the Cabarrus County Concord area is it is a loyalist hotbed. They're supporting the British troops, except for Mary McCurdy. Now, Mary McCurdy, being a good Presbyterian Scotch-Irish lady, goes to the quilting bees, goes to the candle making, goes to the barn raising, attends all these functions, and no one ever talks to her. She just turns the other cheek, turns the other cheek, and turns the other cheek. But while she's there, the loyalist, she's listening to the other ladies talk about the British activities. Not a bad thing, to say the least. Well, one night, she and her house servant Aggie and Mary's two small children hear people outside the house. They take shelter in the basement cellar, and the loyalist men of the neighborhood just come right in. Tromp around the upstairs of the cabin. They can hear them while they're pillaging things and knocking things off and breaking things, and they're talking about burning the cabin. Well, about that time, one of the babies starts to cry, and Aggie tries to strangle it, telling Mary, whispering to Mary, if that baby cries, they're going to kill us. And if I don't keep that baby from crying, it's better the baby die than all of us die. Not an easy decision to make, but in a time of war, perhaps a necessary one. Once they leave her house, Mary McCurdy dresses in her husband's clothes, saddles their horse named Liberty. Pretty big for a horse, don't you think? You tell where their sentiments lie right there. Saddles that horse and goes off to find her husband's militia camp. He was a captain. She makes it into camp. She does such a good job at dressing as a male that they don't even recognize her until she takes down her hat and reveals her hair. She too gives the positions away to the Patriot forces. Interesting ladies. And then we've got some younger ladies, and I got to tell you about these two girls. Has anybody ever traveled Providence Road from Waxhaw to Charlotte? Excellent. Stopped at Old Presbyterian, Waxhaw, Providence Presbyterian Church. You know the militia camp there. British came up the same road. Well, they got up to the Ray House. It's probably 4 or 5 miles outside of Charlotte, maybe 30 miles up from Waxhaw. There were two young ladies out there in the yard. A Jeanette Lewis, about 12, 13 years old, and her sister. And lo and behold, they're out there playing. Here comes Lord Cornwallis and Tarleton. They decide they want a drink of water, and they ask the young ladies to get them a dipper full from the well. Yeah, well, they may have to want to rethink this one. The young ladies get the well, they go to the well, they get the dipper, they bring it back, and they throw the water on Tarleton. Oh, that was not good. They knew they were in trouble, and they run and hide, leaving their mother to face the two gentlemen who are not very happy. Well, Lord Cornwallis just thinks it's funny, and he's just laughing, and he's off his horse. And they say that sapling he carried for a cane, where he stuck it in the ground that day, grew into a tree. Don't know whether he did or not, but that's what we hear. So these ladies are having a really hard time dealing with the British, and they're doing an extremely good job for the most part. The British are just baffled. They don't understand why these women are so hot-blooded, so patriot-minded. They're not realizing they're supporting the troops and defending their homes any way they can, and they're going to soon learn these ladies are going to defend their homes at all costs. Now, I found it rather interesting that some of the men who were associates of Francis Marion, their wives too had some little issues with the British. in the area. One of the ladies is by the name of Jean James. She lived in Williamsburg, a little bit outside King Street, to my understanding. And she too was home. And here they come, the greencoats, the cavalry, British cavalry. She sees them coming, and she hears them coming. Well, she opens the door, stands out on the porch, and the officer is asking for her husband. He is a major. She says he's not here. They just kind of look around. And she says, well, if he will come in and lay down arms, it would go a little bit better for him. Remember, her husband was captured at Charleston and was paroled. He's not to take up arms. I can say he probably took up arms. She looks at the gentleman and says, well, sir, if I could control what my husband does, I would gladly do so. But I guarantee you he will not lay down his arms. He fights more. In retaliation, they burn her house. A little bit further, over in Sherrall, there's a gentleman by the name of Adam Huzik. He operates a ferry. He too has been paroled after being captured at Charleston. And he refuses to ferry the British troops across the river. This is a bad mistake. He actually fires at one of them. That's a worse mistake. They take him prisoner and bring him back to Sherrall, where they actually hold a court-martial for him, since he had been paroled and agreed not to take down arms. They prepare, he's found guilty. I'm not sure what kind of court it was. No one actually spoke in his behalf, except the doctor. And then they burned his house down, took all his livestock, and ran his wife all the way to North Carolina. He defended Mr. Cusick. They're out there building the scaffold for him. His wife and children are all there as well. And they're all standing around just watching, pleading with the British not to hang the gentleman. He's a family man. They have to be able to feed and defend their home. He is their livelihood. They are prostrate with grief and are begging the British officer, and wailing and screaming, and nothing is done. The British major actually gets on his horse and tries to run them down while they lay in the street. Another British officer stops him. Apparently, we do not know whether they actually hung the gentleman or not, according to many references. We do know that they did not burn his house or their home, which was a good thing for that wonderful family. And then, of course, you have Mary Witherspoon. Has anybody ever met Mary Witherspoon? Nice young girl. She's in love with one of the patriot gentlemen with Francis Marion. And he happens to be in her house, keeping an eye on it, to say the very least. And while he's there, she actually is watching every move he makes outside the window, because the British are also in the house. She can see the militia in the trees outside. Now, this British officer is not a very polite gentleman. He is insulting her future husband. Now, ladies, I gotta tell you, Mary Witherspoon takes off her shoe and smacks him in the face. Now, you know, that took a lot of guts to take off that shoe and smack that British officer in the face. There is a little skirmish after this, and I think her husband's side kind of wins. Her future husband's. They are married, but he is killed in battle a few years later, I think 1782. So we have this lady as well, and she is a young widow. Well, what about the war widows? Life is certainly not easy for them. Perhaps you're familiar with Mrs. General Davidson, up toward Davidson, North Carolina. You know, that poor gentleman, they stripped his body of all his clothes and left him naked on the battlefield. They had to bury him under the cover of night. He left a widow and 6 children. No food, no money. At least they didn't burn the house. You have no idea how important it is if they don't burn your house until it happens to you. Had they not burned my house, I would be wearing these clothes today. Mrs. Davidson actually has to apply for a pension in order to support the family, and it takes about a year to get it. Maybe a year to 6 months. For that entire time, she is living off of the generosity of her neighbors. Not an easy life. She eventually remarries and moves west. Anybody been to Kings Mountain? Oh, yes. You know about the women at Kings Mountain, then I'm sure. Yes, I thought it was rather interesting. Does anybody know about Mary Patton from Tennessee? Apparently not. Mary Patton was a Scotch-Irish lady who knew how to make gunpowder. Kind of a different occupation for a woman, to say the very least. Yes, she was trained in that in Europe. And she was living up there, and when John Sevier gets his over-the-mountain men ready to go, Mary Patton makes the gunpowder they take to Kings Mountain. Mary Patton's a very smart woman. She makes and sells her gunpowder and donates it to the militias. Every time she delivered it to a militia camp, she would put shoes on her horse, take the powder where it needed to go, come back and unshoe the horse. No point in wasting those shoes unless you needed them. So without her, most people think the Battle of Kings Mountain could have gone the other way, which would not have been good. Now over there at Kings Mountain after the battle, you have all the wounded and dying or dead. While there's a lady up in Virginia who gets word that her son's at Kings Mountain, she gets on her horse and rides all the way to Kings Mountain only to find him dead. She takes the body back home, all the way to Virginia. Not an easy trip. And while there's Mrs. Preston Goforth up at Shelby, a little bit past Kings Mountain, that woman hooks the sled to her horse and takes off for Kings Mountain. Now, when I'm saying these ladies are traveling, realize this is taking days to get where they're going. She, too, finds her husband's body on the battlefield at Kings Mountain, loads it on the sled, and takes it back home and buries it. Jane McDowell, that I talked to you about earlier, she, too, with her mother, would go to Kings Mountain and stay and nurse the soldiers who were there. So we have these women doing very unique and fascinating things. And for everyone that I've told you about today, I'm sure there are hundreds and countless women who went unnamed. Now you're probably wondering why I chose my outfit. When you think of a colonial lady, you think of someone a little bit better dressed than I am, correct? Not here in the backcountry. As I said earlier, if your house is one of the houses that is destroyed, you have the clothes you're wearing. Most women in the backcountry have 3 sets of clothing. One clean, one dirty, and the one they're wearing. This is it. Once the war starts, you're going to have a hard time managing that. You're not going to be able to travel to Charleston or Salisbury or Williamsburg and collect other fabrics unless you make your own. And you're going to have to wear what you have. be it looking good or be it looking bad. These are the clothes that I have, the same as Elizabeth Jackson or Harriet Hall or any of these other ladies who traveled across the Carolinas trying to find their loved ones or help the troops. If it's what they had, it's what they wore. Now, I do have some extra items with me, and you're probably wondering why a lady is wearing a man's hat. We know Mr. Stallions was shot and killed for wearing one. I choose to wear mine because it's more comfortable than my mob cap. It does keep the weather off when I'm traveling about. I know in a little bit we're going to have a smoking break. If anybody cares to join me, I've got my pipe. If you have yours, you can come outside with me. And if that won't work for you, I can share some tobacco too. The ladies did chew and smoke and spit. Quite well. And I had one lady ask me earlier this morning about my little furs. Well, you have to eat a bunny every now and then if it's the only thing you can find to eat. And I hated to waste the furs. They might make me some shoes later on. This is my second pair. I had some of those English leather shoes and they didn't hold up. Traded these, like most of the ladies did, with the Catawbas or the Cherokees and got me some moccasins. They're much more practical out here traipsing about the countryside. Now, there's one other thing that I'm trying to do as I traipse about my countryside. I'm trying to catch up with the militia because my men folk are in the militia. And I've now reached the decision, after hearing all these other ladies' stories, that possibly a better place for me is going to be with my husband and my men folk in the militia, to say the very least. I can't afford to stay at home any longer along 12 Mile Creek in the Waxhaws because it's just not safe. Now, I'm pretty good with this, and I'm not bad with this either. And I got my knife, but they took my food. I had 40 head of pigs. Armies took them. So when I have no food, the only clothing I have, I'm going to be better off with the Army. Now, if I'm going to belong to the Army, well, not in that sense. If I'm going to belong to the Army, I'm going to have a certificate of good character, and I'm going to have a job. The only way I can stay with the militia is to have a purpose. And many of these women chose that life as to stay home. Safety in numbers. And if I'm with the militia, I get a half a ration of food. Get tired of those beans after a while. Not many of them. Half ration don't last long. Do have access to the doctor if the militia has one with them. And they pretty much move me where they want me to go. The only thing about that, I usually have to stay with the baggage. Actually, we're kind of referred to as the baggage. Not very flattering, to say the least. Especially when I cook and wash for those men and nurse them and write letters and all these other things that need to be done, countless other women. While right after the Battle of Camden, you've been to the Battle of Camden. Well, you know, that was a terrible rout. And things just happened and people just went places. And there's one soldier's account of that. Kind of sounds kind of funny, but I'm sure it was more serious than it sounds. Well, he says after that battle, everybody was just going everywhere, and the tree roots were up, and the stumps were in the road, and the soldiers had laid down their arms and threw away what they didn't need to carry. And here go the wagons with the women on top of the baggage. And every now and then, one of those wagons would hit a stump or a tree or some other debris in the road. And you know who fell off the wagons first? Those women. He said, you've never seen such women bouncing along the road until they got back to Charlotte. It is an interesting time here in the area. People do not realize what the women went through. I've been delighted to be here and share it with you today. And I would like to know if anyone has any questions about anything I've said today or what I'm wearing. I'd be glad to try and answer them now if you like. Does anyone have a question for me?
What do you have in your haversack?
In my haversack? Well, I have all the necessary items. Let's see. I have my yarn, in case I need to repair something. I have my soap in case I need to take a bath. It's going to be too cold before long, you're not going to be able to take one. You have to keep that in mind. Well, sir, how often do you bathe? More than once a year? Oh, and you're not sick? I must ask about that one. I have my notebook if I need it for something. I also have my lead pencil. I'm prepared for anything. My crochet hook. Oh, in my pocket. You do see my pocket. You know, ladies in colonial times, pockets are worn outside. I carry a few other items over there. Got my hanky or my washcloth, depending upon the day. Got my toothbrush. You don't brush your teeth either? I realize I'm so far in the back country. You don't take baths and you don't brush your teeth. Stay away from you people. You might be smelly. Watch that next time. All you gotta do is get a little sweet gum root or a licorice root or something that tastes pretty good and just start gnawing on it. Before long, you got a toothbrush. Never tried that, have you? Oh, and if you run out of anything to use for your toothpaste, there's always charcoal from the fire. It's wonderful. A little gritty. I also have, some tea. I actually pulled me some mint leaves, growing wild, and I made me some mint tea. I still have it with me. Let me see. What else do I have? My pocket. Yeah, that's about it I carry in my pocket. I don't carry too much. I've kind of learned to travel light. The more traveling you do, you kind of put out and get rid of things you no longer need. I do trust that at all. Oh, in my hat, I got my pipe, as I said earlier. I also have some music. I picked me up one of these tin whistles off the battlefield along the way. Nobody seemed to want it, and if I could read, I could figure out how to play that music, but I ain't figured that out yet. I'm sure I'll get to it eventually. It does make pretty noises. You want to hear?
Sure.
Make noise. It makes walking along a lot easier. I got a knife or two back here. And I got my canteen. And just in case I get hungry along the way, I got my pewter cup and my porringer. It was just too much trouble carrying a big plate. It just didn't work well. Now, if I had any knives and spoons and forks, I'd have those too. But I melted those down. I needed some bullets. Got my own gunpowder in a little pouch as well. Got my fan. It gets a little hot down here, I understand. Oh, and I've got my little 10-punch lantern. And you guys do have lint, right? You don't have lint. I can see this table over here going, no, we don't have any lint. You know how to make lint. No, they're going. Well, now everybody knows how to make lint. You gotta have lint to get a fire started. You just pull apart some fabric. Leave the strings, makes lint. It's easy to do. I can show you. It's excellent. So I've got my lantern in case I have to spend the night, it gets a little dark. I had a bigger one, but this one's working well for now. Got a couple of candles I made. Got my petticoat on, because if I have extra stuff to carry, well, I just fold it right up as the ladies would do, and tuck it in, and I just have a nice pocket here. I saw me some sweet potatoes in the field. Might have to go back and get some of those for lunch. Anybody want to come with me and help me cook them? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for listening. I think my time is about up. If you have any more questions, I'll be around today, and I'll be the one in the different clothes. We've got 2 more minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear what the women in the backcountry were doing, and obviously they weren't serving tea.
Well, no,
to the
ma'am,
British officers.
we can't drink that British tea.
They weren't.
They were, they would have been. That's true.
Thank you so much. George, do we have time to take a break?
Yeah, let's take about 15 minutes.
Okay, fine.